Hello everyone. This video is going to focus on argumentative research writing. These are simply going to be strategies to keep in mind as you begin to develop your argumentative research writing essay. This video is going to highlight argumentative elements specifically that you may want to consider as you develop your essay. Please note that in addition to the argumentative research strategies, there are other elements that you'll want to consider as you think about the language you'll use, the types of evidence, and the organizational structure for your essay. Please be sure to watch all the other videos as it'll give you a more broad approach on how you might refine and revise your essay as you engage in the writing process. Let's go ahead and get started. First, you want to consider about how you're going to build an idea into an argument. The key aspect here is to state what you want others to see. As we write, especially as it relates to an argumentative research essay, we are in the moment. And when I say that we are in the moment, we tend to assume that our readers know exactly what it is that we are talking about or what we are thinking. This is a common mistake that we make, and we tend to leave information out, as well as not be clear about how we want our readers to view or the perspective that we want them to take on as far as the information that we present. So keep in mind then, as you are developing your argument, you may end up refocusing, developing, expanding, or otherwise modifying claims that you make throughout. It's important to keep track from beginning to end about what others are going to see. If you do this, it'll help you stay on topic and cover all of the important and essential elements in order to make your argument the strongest. It's suggested that as you make your claims, to make them in single sentences and not to make them complex. You don't need to jam all of the claims that you're making in one statement. You have multiple places throughout the course of the essay where you might list those claims. Moreover, you might be including a lot of the claims at the very beginning versus toward the end. And you may or may not have more than one or two claims. It really depends on the scope of the argument that you are having. Do keep in mind, however, that for every claim that you have, it's going to require deep explanation. Do keep in mind that each of the claims that you have will require elaboration, clear explanations, as well as substantial evidence. The type of evidence that you have is all going to be dependent on the kind of claim that you make. One of the first tips that we have about creating your claims to support your argument is to start with the evidence that you found. The evidence, of course, is going to be a key player in the credibility that you have, how strong your argument is going to be. So more often than not, students tend to start off with the claims because they have these ideas or reasons, if you will, as to why they're making the argument they are to begin with. Sometimes this can lead to biased writing. Sometimes this will lead to our own positions and opinions about things without acknowledging whether or not there's evidence there to support it. So sometimes we suggest that you examine the evidence and facts that you found in order to determine the kinds of claims you'll be making about them, or moreover, what you're going to be making about the much larger argument. So if you're finding that you don't have much of it, you're going to have to be mindful that then you will not have many claims to make. While you can make claims without substantial evidence, you'll find that a majority of your evidence is going to be qualified, which isn't the strongest way to approach an argumentative research essay. So, as you're identifying the type of argument or claim you want to make, you need to consider the kinds of arguments you're trying to make. Now, you may end up having the same types of arguments throughout your entire essay, or you may end up having different types of arguments over the course of your essay. It really is going to depend on what claim you're trying to make and how you are designing it. So if each of the claim warrants you to have a specific type of argument, or at least the kind of argument that's going to require specific moves, that is to say, the type of support you're going to include, evidence and elaboration. If you know the kind of argument making, it makes that process easier. First, we'll look at arguments of definition. So in another video, I've indicated that you want to be clear about concepts of definition. And your background research and some of the other assignments that you had, you were asked to identify key concepts and terms that might play a role in your argument, and knowing the definitions and where they actually come from. We know that in different types of arguments and discourse and debate, that definitions tend to evolve, change, or take on different meaning depending on the space and the type of argument that you're having. So for a person to argue effectively, we always want to make clear what kind of definition or categories we're labeling certain things as. So in an instance, for example, you want to establish what categories might be possible ways to describe an event or phenomenon that you are trying to define and what criteria you're selecting for it. So that's going to be the first step, is to make clear what those are if you are labeling or categorizing something. So let's say there is an event, an example or a situation that took place, and you want to label that event as something. So as an example, let's say you were having a discussion about gun rights or some version of that, and there was an event or a situation that took place in which a matter happened with a gun, and you are wanting to label or categorize that situation as, let's say, a violation of gun rights for whatever reason. You'll need to explain how that or event or phenomenon matches or pairs with the label or the category or definition that you are giving, and then show how it fits that definitional criteria. That's going to be important because it lets us know how you are attempting to make this argument. If you leave this out, you are making an assumption that, number one, your audience knows exactly what you're talking about, which they will not, but also you are risking a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the information that you are providing, which can be damaging to your argument. So not only do you want to describe the event, phenomenon, situation in a clear way, but you also want to show how that thing or event fits the definitional criteria that you've selected or chosen. As far as argument over cause is concerned, it is not uncommon to argue causation. When we argue causation, what we're trying to do is show how one situation is transformed into another. This is basically your causation. This caused that. Okay. In some instances, when we're showing causation, we have to isolate specific factors, forces, or sequence of events as being responsible for bringing about that change or what caused that change. So be cautious not to just say some broad thing or event or situation caused something. It could be a factor that you're arguing and saying this could have contributed to this, or this could have brought about this change because of some element of it. And you'll need to be clear, again, showing how that transformation happened or the sequence of event happened. You'll need to provide evidence to demonstrate that it was indeed that mechanism that caused that. Without the evidence and without the clear explanations, then we are just simply relying on what we call correlation. Now, it is not uncommon for people to use correlation to imply causation. The reason for this is, if we think about the concept of correlation, that is to say that certain events, phenomenon, situations occur simultaneously, right? So let's say, for instance, every fall I step outside of my house and it always rains on Monday. And I want to imply that it's my stepping outside of my house that's causing this rain. Well, I step outside of my house, event number one that takes place, and then the rain takes place. Those are two things that happen simultaneously, and let's say they've happened multiple times. Well, I cannot imply that my stepping out is what caused that unless I can show it in some way using evidence or some other aspect. Okay, so be very careful, because this is very easy to do, as it happens with political discussions, economics, situations of that nature, where we want to show that something caused the other, but we often leave the evidence or to show how that mechanism was the thing that caused that other thing to occur. Next, argument of cause. In addition to showing the mechanism or evidence, we sometimes rely on analogy in order to present information, or at least to simplify information for a much more complex topic or issue. Okay, so analogies are okay to use. And in fact, I think that we rely on analogies quite a bit. We know that analogies are not perfect examples of something else, because if they were, then they would be the very thing that it is. Analogies are going to have weak aspects and cannot be 100%, but we do want to use analogies in order to demonstrate or support a claim of something. So we compare, right? When we are comparing to an analogy, we want to examine all aspects of it: purpose, intent, the context of it, because we often rely on analogies in not very positive ways, because it's the easiest thing to do, and if it makes sense to the audience, then we get away with it. But once you begin to analyze some of the analogies that you'll see in other arguments, they end up being a lot weaker than we think. So be mindful of how you're comparing. And as an example, especially when it comes to education and quality of education, we tend to compare the United States to other countries. You have to remember that there are other factors to consider besides, this country's better education because numbers. Well, there are other factors to consider and variables to consider: context, class system, economics, things of that nature. So if you're just relying on the large context of, look at this piece of data, it shows that United States, pales in comparison, without giving the intricacies of it or describing it, then it becomes simply a weak analogy. Argument over evaluation. So sometimes when we are developing our arguments, we tend to take on evaluative claims. So this could be things like identifying whether something's good or bad, or effective or non-effective, or quality or non-quality, depending on what your evaluative measures are. You want to consider how and the purpose of the evaluative measures to begin with. Why are you even bringing it up? Okay, so you'll need to be clear about the purpose of the evaluation, why it's even necessary, for what and for whom. So don't just bring in argument of evaluation and not have a reason for doing it. If you're just simply trying to be manipulative and say something's better than the other without giving a reason to say why or for whom or for what, then it becomes a weak argument. Okay, so you'll need to establish the criteria of whatever it is that you're measuring, and then naturally the evidence that indicates that. So if you're trying to identify if something's good or bad, whatever that might be, then you'll need to have evidence that indicates how well that object matches the criteria you've established. So what is good, you'll need to be clear. What is bad, you'll need to be clear. Explain yourself, and then provide evidence to show how the thing that you're arguing falls underneath those categories. Okay, so again, consider the purpose of the evaluation, the criteria, and of course the evidence that matches or disputes the information. Next, argument over policy. So for argument over policy is to establish or argue or claim that there is a course of action that should be taken, and more often than not, it is suggested that it's the wisest or the best course of action. Now, keep in mind that this can be the entire essay, or it could just be certain aspects of the essay, depending on what you're trying to do. So first, you'll establish that there's a need for this course of action or change. And through that process, what we'll do then is, make a statement of the current situation that reveals. So a statement of the problem or identification of the problem or threat. And you will present that first because that gives us a rationale for why you're even presenting this action or change. And then you'll want to consider for whom, right? Is it the target audience or just participant people that it affects? Sometimes the audience is not always the people that you are focusing on in your argument. Now, with that being said, you have to understand that there are different courses of actions or alternative solutions, and you are merely presenting one or two of them depending on what you're doing. And you'll need to justify yours, right? So justify your plans, justify the evidence that shows that your plan or course of action is likely to be the most effective. You also want to consider projection of the cost in time, money, or trouble in comparison to other solutions. So, thinking about your end goal for your audience, if they select and accept your position, your plan, your course of change, is it going to be more trouble than it's worth for them to just, keep on doing what they're doing or pursue another line of action? So that all needs to be established and be made clear in your writing as well. Next, identifying attitudes, beliefs, value systems, ideologies, and things of that nature. You all did this in the assignments that led up to this point. And what that's going to do is allow you to, what I call, play chess in your writing. And what that means is anticipating oppositions, anticipating questions that about the claims that you're going to bring up. So it doesn't matter what way you argue. So if it's by definition or policy or, evaluative measures, if you're presenting that, what can you anticipate from your audience or anyone involved about the points that you are bringing up? And in some cases, it may require you to address those points prior to them even having the opportunity to bring them up. This could be considered as your, counterclaims or oppositions. And then, of course, addressing those issues that they might have by satisfying those who might have doubts. So how will you not only identify what they are and present them in your paper, but how will you satisfy those issues and needs? This, of course, helps with the audience, the likeliness of you being able to persuade them into the course of action or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So how do you do this? Well, consider the benefit to the readers. We're human, and more often than not, when we're arguing somebody, especially to do something or to consider a perspective or accept one for that matter, we always need to know how we would benefit. And so you have a list of questions here to consider. Are you trying to, resolve a problem, adding new evidence, questioning a new, creating a new perspective? What do you hope will happen? Depending on the level or magnitude of all of this, and again, it doesn't always have to happen in the large scheme of your paper, but it could just be one aspect of your argument that you are appeasing to your audience. Finally, points to consider is qualifying statements. So as I said before, that depending on your topic and how you're presenting it, we may not always have the strongest evidence to present. So, but at the same time, we realize these claims might be equally important as part of the conversation, debate, or discussion. So you'll need to qualify those weaker claims. Knowingly, you're presenting these weaker claims, you'll need to kind of justify or qualify in this instance, by being transparent and talking about the limitations of these claims that you're making, but also trying to address why they were significant and important to begin with. So this can still establish your credibility as you write as well. You'll want to keep these argumentative aspects in mind. As I said before, they may be a large part of your writing or smaller elements of your writing. Ultimately, you may have general ideas about how you're going to want to argue, but keep in mind that if you decide to include these different argumentative aspects, which a lot of times you will, you'll need to include the things that go with it. So those will be things I'll be looking for in your essay as well. Keep in mind that the writing process is always a messy one, and it asks you to stay flexible. You may end up changing your mind. You may end up taking away, adding things. It just really depends. But as you are engaging in the writing process, do consider some of these elements and the other ones presented in the other videos as you begin finalizing your argumentative research paper.